Professor Habib, thank you so much for riding with me today.
It's a pleasure.
Very difficult economic times for South Africa, reiterated by the Minister of Finance yesterday in his pre-election budget. We know that there are improvements in the world economy, not spectacular improvements, but significant improvements. Yet South Africa, on the other hand, seems to be losing traction in terms of the gains that it's made following its strong recovery from the recession. A lot of experts are saying it comes down to politics, to policy implementation. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think it's a combination of things. I think that firstly, it is about policy implementation, and more fundamentally, whether our policies are addressing the structural problems in our society. I think too often, private sector economists seem to be simply focused on growth. Now, I think growth is fundamental and important. But if you focus solely on growth and don't focus on the kind of job-creating growth we need, focus on growth that allows us to address inequality, then we're not addressing our structural problems. I think, yes, government has failed in being able to articulate and implement policy. But I also think the private sector's assumptions about why a government's failure is as simplistic in the extreme. It's people who look at statistical data, who've never got into a car like this and driven into a township and understood and spoken to real people. And so they they think they understand the structural crisis of South Africa. They haven't truly understood it. They don't understand why we're having service delivery protests. They can't understand why we have the explosion of labor strikes in our platinum belt. And that is about trying to understand expectations. And those economists don't understand expectations in the least bit. So for me, there is a concern about government and its failure to implementation, but there's also a bigger concern about the private sector and whether it truly understands what is needed to address the challenges in our society.
But would it be fair to say that the lack of growth and job creation and the inability to reduce inequality is really a South African problem?
It is not only a South African problem. That's the irony. It's a global problem. What we are seeing is across the world, the nature of the economy is fundamentally changing. And because it's fundamentally changing, we have huge challenges on the nature of work, on stable employment, on young people being employed. The issue of youth unemployment is a global problem. It's recognized by the World Economic Forum, by the IMF, by the World Bank, by all major partners have recognized it. I mean, Europe is confronting unemployment levels at young people on the same scale that South Africa is. And so this has become a global problem. The manifestation of that problem is fundamentally different in South Africa than it is in a place like Western Europe. So what does it mean? Is it a global problem? Obviously. But the chances are that if you're in the middle of Europe and you're unemployed, you get the dole. You get support from the state. The chances of you starving are minimal. In South Africa, the chances of you starving are quite dramatic. In this society, we have children who fall into pit latrines and die. They suffocate in feces. Can you imagine that happening in the middle of Germany or this thing? So when people speak about growth, growth is fundamental. But growth on its own will not address our challenges. And that's the fundamental thing that private sector economists have not understood in South Africa.
So very dire economic times for ordinary South Africans. And South Africans are disillusioned. They're feeling very disillusioned right now. But we're getting all these promises coming to the table now because it's election times in South Africa. If we have to look at the economic objectives being put on the table by the DA, for example, to reduce unemployment by half, to grow the economy by 8%, and to create 6 million jobs over the next 10 years. That also looks like pie in the sky.
It is, and what worries me is not simply the promises that are articulated. It's how do you think you're going to do that? Get rid of the Labour Relations Act? Do you really think which minister or a leader in their right minds thinks that the trade union movement is just going to simply say, okay, get rid of the Labour Relations Act after 50 years of struggling for it? I've said this to a couple of leaders the other day. Whether you agree on the Labour Relations Act or not, just understand what it means. If you want to get rid of the Labour Relations Act and COSATU goes to the streets, you've got two options. Either you smash it or you cut a deal with it.